And thank you for coming. We might as well get underway. Our guest is here with us until 3:45, so we've got half an hour essentially. So we want to kind of get going. Just by way of introduction, Dominik Stillhart is Director of Operations at the International Committee of the Red Cross. As Director of Operations, he is responsible for the strategic definition, conduct, and review of humanitarian operations carried out by the organization's 13,000 staff in some 80 countries. That's a lot of people. He conducts regular field visits to assess firsthand the humanitarian situation on the ground. His recent visits include Myanmar and Afghanistan, obviously very topical issues. He will update us on their priorities for 2018. Dominik, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah. And thank you for reminding me of my job description.
Benefit about this.
Okay, good afternoon to all of you. Very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you a few minutes. I'm here on a yearly visit. I have just also gone to Ottawa and Washington, essentially presenting our appeals, humanitarian plans for 2018. We have now proposed for this year, 2018, a budget, yearly field budget of $1.8 billion US dollars. We have actually 16,000 plus staff deployed in the field, not 13,000. It's 16,000 now, and we are active in about 80 different countries worldwide. The budget that we are proposing for our field operation this year, 1.8 billion, is 80% more than the budget that we had in 2010-11, in the first decade, actually pretty much the first decade of this century. And this clearly is in response to increasingly protracted conflict and the growing humanitarian needs. If I look at our 10 largest operations that we are running in the Icrc, the average presence, the average length of presence now is 37 years. So this is another demonstration for how protracted conflicts in the meantime have become and how intractable they are for political conflict resolution. We also see more humanitarian needs in these contexts, and the result, and this is in our view for a number of reasons, including first and foremost that I'd say for the pretty much the past decade or even slightly more, we've seen an increasingly permissive environment for the use of force. On one hand, you have non-state armed groups that are gleefully violating the most basic rules of international humanitarian law, and on the other side, you have states that take exception to the respect of international humanitarian law in their fight against terrorism. Foreign policy today is very often seen through the exclusive prism of fighting terrorism, and labeling groups as terrorists gives very often states the license to treat these groups as such. And all of this is creating what I said just before, a more permissive environment for the use of force. Another reason for growing humanitarian needs is the fact that more and more of the conflicts are actually taking place in urban areas. We've seen Aleppo, Mosul, Raqqa, all highly densely populated urban areas where conflict is taking place, and people are not just suffering the direct consequences of conflict, they are increasingly also suffering the indirect consequences of conflict because of the destruction of vital infrastructure in the field of water, health, sanitation, education, and so on and so forth. And Yemen is definitely a case in point, where last year the outbreak of the worst cholera epidemic in recent history is not just a health crisis. This is the result of the direct result of conflict that has destroyed more than 50% of hospitals, hospitals and health structure, health workers not being paid for 1.5 years, people who are collecting garbage not being paid. When I was in Sanaa last year in April, I saw garbage piling up 2-3 meters in the street, and of course as soon as the rainy season started, this has created the most fertile ground for the spread of this horrible cholera epidemic that has now affected more than 1 million people. Looking at some of our operational priorities and the differences compared to a year ago, I think, at least from my perspective, and you just said it, I visited Myanmar just before the end of the year. The crisis in Rakhine is definitely the latest one that we are responding to. Since the 25th of August last year, we are focusing very much on Rakhine, on the Rakhine state, not that much on Bangladesh, because there are many other humanitarian organizations. But in Rakhine, the International Committee of the Red Cross is the only international organization present on the ground responding to the crisis. And Myanmar, if I look at our budget for 2018, is now among the top 10 largest operations that we are running. In the Middle East, I'd say perhaps the main difference is the sharply deteriorated situation in Yemen. Yemen in many ways is the new Syria. It is now the most serious humanitarian crisis that we are responding to, up to 18 million people that are in need of assistance. And the situation continues to deteriorate, with a conflict that is increasingly fragmented on both sides. Actually, in both major blocks there is fragmentation, and we have a number of active front lines throughout the country, as we have just now seen with the latest offensive on Taiz that is underway as we speak. We have 70 international staff in Yemen, 350 national staff. We are present in Sana'a, in Aden, in Taiz, in Hodeida, as well as in the north in Sada. So this is a very significant, substantial operation that we are running there in Yemen. We are, of course, we continue to pay a lot of attention to the situation in Syria, where conflict has re-escalated or continued to escalate, I would say, end 2017, beginning of 2018. In Idlib in particular, in and around Idlib, as well as in eastern Ghouta, in Afrin now, and in the northeast. So a number of hotspots that continue to create new displacement. In 2017 alone, we have seen 500,000 people returning to Syria, especially displaced people and a number of refugees. But we've also seen 1.3 million people that have been newly displaced in Syria in 2017. In Africa, I'd say the good news compared to a year ago is that widespread famine was prevented. I remember a year ago we were all holding our breath in terms of this terrible food insecurity, or the 4 famines as they were termed in Yemen that we already spoke about, but in particular also in the African countries of Somalia, South Sudan and the Lake Chad. Thanks to significant mobilization of donors and the presence of organizations on the ground, including our own, famine has been prevented, although the situation remains extremely fragile in all these countries. The one country that I'm really very concerned about is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the situation has deteriorated in 2017. Most of it related to political violence, and we think that this is a trend that is going to continue in 2018. And the challenge is that the Democratic Republic of Congo is on nobody's radar. This is not a country that attracts a lot of attention, and that is also not a country that attracts a lot of funding. I will stop here and open for questions. We are, of course, also present in many other different countries that I'm happy to answer questions if I can, but I will stop here and wait for your question.
So I'll just ask one question and then we'll open it up to the floor. I mean, you talk about the protracted and intractable nature of conflicts today, whether you're talking about Yemen, Syria, you use the DRC, which is a good example. Are we to reasonably expect some sort of solution to these conflicts? Or, given the intransigence we often confront in the Security Council, is this the new normal that we just have to sort of come to terms with?
Yeah, protracted crisis is definitely the new normal. Without any doubt, and one of the reasons for this is indeed that all of these conflicts, that you can take any of the conflicts, those that I mentioned or others, they do have local roots, but they are today very often manipulated by regional powers as well as global powers who fundamentally disagree about how to go, what the solution should be to these contexts. So in the face of these very deep-set disagreements between regional and global powers, we will unfortunately see many of these conflicts go on for quite some time. The notable exception in the past few years was the peace agreement in Colombia. This is about the only country that saw the resolution of a conflict that lasted for a very long time.
All right, Edith Lederer, the Associated Press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stillhart. You had one shocking figure to me, that the top 10 conflicts in the world were averaging 37 years. Is that a cumulative total of 37 years or for each of the conflicts? And as a second question, on Myanmar, since the ICRC is the only humanitarian organization in Rakhine, could you give us a sense of what's going on there? What are you finding in terms of the needs of the people, burned out villages? What's going on there?
Okay, to your first question, I'm afraid the answer is that this is an average. This is the average length of the ICRC presence in our 10 largest operations: Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, DRC, the Israel and the occupied territories. And so the average presence, length of presence in the ICRC in the 10 largest operations is 37 years. This is not cumulative, it's average. In Myanmar, as I said before, I had the opportunity before the end of the year to visit Rakhine, including the north of Rakhine. And what struck me really, what struck me most is the fact that both communities, they live in fear of each other. I can give you an example. We visited a few villages. 2 villages, they were just adjacent to each other. One was a Rakhine village, the other one is a Rohingya village. And I asked the question first in the Rakhine village, what is the situation? And they told me, we live in fear of the other community. This is one of the Rakhine villages that suffered from the attacks on the 25th of August. And ever since the 25th of August, nobody ventured out of the Rakhine village to see their neighbor, which was just a village 500 meters away. Despite the fact that they know each other very well, they shared a health center together until the 25th of August, but this is now, at least for the time being, not the case anymore. More worrying is the situation for the Rohingya population, without any doubt, because they are still asking themselves every day whether they should stay or whether they should leave. And this is not because of ongoing violence. This is primarily because their access to livelihoods is severely curtailed. They can access the fields around the village, but they cannot venture much further out of their village and, for instance, go to Mongdao or to any other urban centers, where many of them actually have shops. So in terms of livelihoods, it's extremely difficult for them, and this is the reason why they are asking themselves every day whether they should also join the rest of the population that has already fled. And that is really today perhaps over and above the terrible violence that has taken place, the main issue that needs to be addressed in the northern Rakhine, as far as I could see on the ground.
Hi, I'm Carol Landry with Agence France Presse. Are you present in North Korea, and do you have anything to say about the humanitarian situation there and sanctions?
Yeah, we have an office in Pyeongchang. We have 6 or 7 international staff in that office. Unfortunately, we are operating with severe restrictions in terms of freedom of movement, and it is therefore not possible for us to get an independent understanding of what the humanitarian situation looks like and what the impact of the sanctions is. The main reason for the presence that we have in that office, and we are, by the way, present on both sides in DPRK and in the Republic of Korea, is to re-establish family links between the families that have been separated by the conflict there. And that is, of course, today a very politicized question, has always been. But this is the kind of main reason and the main file on which we are working, and we have been working for a long time.
James Bays of Al Jazeera.
Hello. In the sort of grim catalogue of conflict zones you're talking about, it seems that you are most concerned now, as well as Syria, by Yemen. Can I ask you not about the humanitarian situation in Yemen, but your other role as the guardian of the Geneva Conventions? The rules of war and international humanitarian law and whatever, how are they being treated in Yemen right now?
I will not tell you how they are being treated. What I can tell you is that we are talking to the states that are either directly or indirectly involved in the conduct of hostilities in Yemen, including in Saudi Arabia. We just had a visit of our president to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, at the beginning of last week, Monday, Tuesday, and the main point of discussion was talking about the conduct of hostilities in Yemen. And compared to a year ago, I have to say we have made some progress, at least in being able to have a meaningful dialogue on some of the interventions that we do in a confidential and bilateral manner.
So the improvement is the dialogue, it's not that they're killing less people?
The improvement for now is the dialogue, and the other thing I'll not talk about.
Questions at the back, please.
May I ask you, please, do you have an access for the areas which had witnessing crisis? Like recently, yesterday, south of Damascus, they have kind of bombing or chemical attacks, something like that. Do you have an easy access to these areas, or you know?
Are you talking about Eastern Ghouta?
Yes.
Yeah, access is difficult. The last time we had access to Eastern Ghouta is just before the end of last year, where we evacuated together with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent 27 people in urgent need of medical care, which was part of a deal that was reached, which allowed this evacuation before the end of the year. But I can't say anything about the allegations that we've also seen. We are extremely concerned about these allegations, but we are we haven't been able to independently verify these attacks that we have also been that we also read about.
As we wait for more hands, let me take you back to the Democratic Republic of Congo. You say it's a situation that is going to deteriorate over the coming year. We know that there's supposed to be elections in December of 2018. What's your assessment of the political situation? How is that influencing the contingency plans that your organization is making on the ground?
Well, we've seen, for instance, last year that violence has spread to areas that for a very long time have actually been spared from violence. The Democratic Republic of Congo is known for violence in the east, in the Kivus, north and south, and indeed violence has spread to different areas, including the Kasai, which is a perfect illustration for the type of political violence that is spreading. Also, Tanganyika is another area where we have seen similar dynamics at work, and each and every time we see it's not just small-scale conflict. It is, again, conflict with local roots that is manipulated and immediately leads to large-scale population displacements. The Democratic Republic of Congo is today the country in Africa with the highest number of internally displaced, and we are likely to see more of this in 2018. And of course, much will depend whether the electoral calendar that has now been fixed, whereby elections should take place, I think, on the 23rd of December this year, is really going to, whether this time it's really going to work. And the more this is going to be postponed, the more I think it is likely that we will see longer term and more violence.
But in terms of the contingency plans, what do you?
We have significantly we have upscaled already last year. We have opened, for instance, an office in places where we haven't been present, Kasai in particular, and we are clearly looking at other places where violence could break out and see whether we also have to mount a presence. So this is really the country where we want to draw attention. Our president is going in March, not least also to draw more attention to the situation in this country. So we are scaling up, we are mobilizing, including also for resources.
Errol.
Thank you. Mr. Dominik, whatever you said so far, in sort of cumulative way, how would you describe the crisis in Myanmar? And did you have the chance to talk to authorities? Just one small follow-up to James' question. Since you refuse to answer to one part of the question, obviously you are a humanitarian worker, not a politician, but it looks like by refusing to answer to that question, you are in some kind of politics. Is that so?
Well, thank you for that question. Look, for us, the dilemma is the following. We are on the ground. We have staff on the ground in many of these situations, and we are not just a relief organization. We are not just delivering food parcels. We are monitoring the conduct of hostilities, and we are visiting people detained in relation to the conflict. And we do interventions with the authorities based on our observations. But we are not doing that publicly. This is not what we are doing because we don't want to jeopardize the presence of our people on the ground and their capacity to intervene on behalf of the civilian population, both in terms of assisting these populations, but also in order to protect what we have as confidential and bilateral dialogue. This is our way of working. It is not easy always for our delegates, for us as an organization, but that is the way we are working, not only in Yemen or in Myanmar, but everywhere.
So you are not saying not answering actually. Did you have a contact with Myanmar authorities?
We do, including with the armed forces.
And you can't tell us too much about that conversation.
Not too much, no.
Frank Isiardo from TRT World. I wanted to ask you a follow-up and a question. First of all, what do you need from the Syrian government as far as access and your present needs? What are you not getting? And number two is your reaction to the Trump cuts to UNRWA.
Okay, in Syria, for instance, last year we do not. Okay, in Syria we are working from inside with consent of all the parties, including the government. So we don't do cross-border operations. We work from inside Syria and we cross front lines from inside Syria. Last year we did about 50 plus operations that took us across these front lines to areas that are usually referred to as besieged areas, Eastern Ghouta being one, where we were several times in 2017. So we are in constant discussions and negotiations, not only, by the way, with the Syrian government. In Idlib today, our challenge is much more to get the consent of the parties inside Idlib to assist the people in these areas. This is for us the challenge in terms of accessing the areas in Idlib. Your UNRWA. On UNRWA, we are, of course, I have to say, we are concerned with that situation. This may indeed over time lead, if there isn't any positive development in terms of funding for UNRWA, this may indeed lead to a situation, especially in Gaza, where people will be laid off, schools being closed, and this is definitely not good news, especially in Gaza, where the humanitarian situation is already difficult, as we all know. So we are observing that situation very carefully and hope, of course, that UNRWA will find the necessary funds to run their schools, not just in the West Bank, but also in particular in Gaza. We have particular concern with regards to the situation in Gaza.
Do you see it as destabilizing?
Say again?
Do you see this as a destabilizing event?
It is difficult to anticipate, but possibly yes.
Probably final question, Mario, Spanish news agency.
Thank you. Mario Villa with Icrc. I want to ask you about the work that you're doing in Venezuela and what is the outlook of the humanitarian situation there this year?
Yeah, we are, of course, like everybody else, watching what is happening in Venezuela. We have a team on the ground working with the Venezuelan Red Cross. What we see is a very difficult socio-economic situation. We see people leaving Venezuela, especially to Colombia, but also into some of the Caribbean islands, putting increased pressure on some of these very fragile situations already. So all I can tell you is that we are there, and we will respond as much as we possibly can to the situation in Venezuela. But it is also difficult to anticipate what is going to happen in the coming months, in the run-up to these elections, and I think the jury is out. We are watching.
It's exactly 3:45, so we have to wrap. Can I just ask you to conclude by sort of referencing what you would want from the Security Council? What role do they have in making your life easier?
I think one of the most important roles that I would expect from the Security Council is to be strong on respect for international humanitarian law, because one of the reasons why we see large-scale humanitarian consequences in many of the conflicts today is that international humanitarian law is insufficiently respected. So I really expect the Security Council to be strong on upholding international humanitarian law.
Well, good luck with that. Thank you very much. Dominik Stillhart, thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.